This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. We often talk about pretty old history on this show, but today's topic may be familiar to some listeners out there. We're covering one of the most scandalous elections in recent Minnesota history, the gubernatorial race of 1990. That year, Republican Arne Carlson unseated Democrat Rudy Perpich, the state's longest-serving governor, after being added to the ballot at the last minute. What made things so unusual was that Carlson hadn't won the primary. He only earned a spot on the ballot after the Republican-endorsed candidate, Jon Grunseth, ended his campaign just 9 days before Election Day amid scandalous allegations. It was such a momentous political event that at least one of the people involved is still pondering it. Bill Hanley was an executive at Twin Cities Public Television, which aired the only debate of the general election 11 days before Election Day. It remains the highest-rated, locally produced show in TPT history. Hanley oversaw the debate and wondered whether their decision to allow Carlson to participate may have been decisive in Carlson's victory. He submitted this question to Curious Minnesota, which is why we're talking about it today. And we're going to hear from Bill in a little bit once we give a little bit more context about what this race was all about. Today, I'm talking with veteran Star Tribune reporter Randy Furst, who both covered portions of this campaign and wrote a story on this question for Curious Minnesota, which I will link to in the show notes. Here's my conversation with Randy. Welcome. I'm here with Randy Furst, who is, I think, one of the longest-serving reporters at the Star Tribune. You've been here for 49 years, is that right?
Something
like that?
49.
Amazing.
It's amazing to me when I got hired at the paper. They said, I hope you stay 5 years.
Yeah.
I looked at them and thought, 5 years? You think I'm going to stay here 5?
Yeah. So we're rewinding to 1990. So I was 3 years old in New York, so I have no personal memory of this.
And I was about 44 years old,
okay.
As I recall.
Randy and I have always been the sort of young and old duo in the newsroom, I think.
That's right.
I used to help you set up your phones and
yeah,
things like that.
You were my geek for everything. You're an amazing geek.
Okay, so here we are talking about an election that happened a little under 30 years ago because it was such a momentous thing. So let's start with Rudy Perpich is the longest-serving governor in Minnesota history at this point. Sort of set the scene for us here. It's 1990. What's the political vibe heading into this election? You know, we've got this longest-serving governor. He's a Democrat. What are people thinking?
Well, Perpich is a very popular governor. He's from the Iron Range. He got elected once. Then he lost in the next election. Then he came back and won again. He appealed to the working class, and he was a little idiosyncratic in some of his things. But this is a guy that, looks like he's going to be elected to another term.
Okay.
On the other hand, he's got an opponent who is new to the political scene. He was Jon Grunseth. Mm-hmm. Jon came out of Ecolab, where he was a vice president for public relations, and he's a conservative guy, and he decides he's going to run for governor. Yeah. He's got a lot of support, including Tim Pawlenty, who later became governor, too.
Okay.
And there's a primary. Yeah. He faces off against Arne Carlson, who was a state auditor. Arne is a more liberal guy. Mm-hmm. He's pro-choice, and he's actually had endorsement of one or two labor unions when he ran for auditor. And the more conservative Grunseth swamps him in the primary. Oh, okay. So the face-off now will be Jon Grunseth versus Rudy Perpich. Oh, okay. In the general election.
Right. And so, basically we're in October or sort of October-ish 1990 when things start to go south for Grunseth, and it starts with a one of these classic big front page days at the Star Tribune where I think it's the headlines which we have on the story is allegations rock governor's race or something like that. So what are these allegations? Because we have to go back to Hastings in 1981 as part of this story.
8-column headline on the front page. Yeah, you go to Hastings. Two women in their early 20s came to the newspaper and spoke with a reporter named Alan Short, claiming that 9 years before, when they were teenagers, 13 years old or so, they participated in a pool party at Jon Grunseth's house on a Saturday night in Hastings.
Okay.
And that they said, as it got later, Grunseth suggested that everybody take off their clothes and do a nude swim.
Okay.
And Grunseth disrobed, and others disrobed, and these two 13-year-olds, they did not disrobe. They were swimming in the pool. It's around midnight, and one of them, the 13-year-old, claims that Jon Grunseth swam up to her and tried to remove a strap from her bathing suit and tried to touch her still covered breast.
Okay.
At which point she swam away and quickly got out of the pool. And here we are with this allegation 9 years later. She signs an affidavit alleging this happened. So does one of her friends. And the Star Tribune has a couple of other affidavits supporting other elements of this.
Right.
Grunseth denies the whole thing completely, says it never happened. His daughter, who was a friend of one of these women, she denies that it ever happened.
Right.
So that's on the front page, and it shakes up the campaign big time.
And we're about a month out or 2 weeks out from
3 weeks out at this point.
3 weeks out. So we're heading into the final days before Election Day. So what's sort of the fallout from this? I mean, that's a pretty big deal, right, that this is on the front page that close to Election Day?
Yeah, Arne Carlson starts getting encouragement to jump into the election again.
Okay.
So he starts a write-in campaign.
Okay.
For governor. Well, something like that is unlikely to succeed, but he has this write-in campaign, and Grunseth is getting dogged by the media more and more.
Okay.
In fact, the same day that the Star Tribune expose ran, there was an interview that ran in the Sunday edition of the Pioneer Press by Bruce Orwell. They interviewed Grunseth, and during the interview, they asked him about rumors that Grunseth was involved in affairs. And Grunseth readily admitted that he was involved in affairs, but said, this is the kind of thing I think that a warm-blooded American did, and this was before he was married.
Right, said he was a warm-blooded American male, something like that.
Which is not a line that really helped him, I think, with women in Minnesota. In fact, his campaign manager later wrote in a book that may have hurt him more than the Star Tribune expose.
Okay, so just to set the scene, we're like we're not that far out from the election. Suddenly, the leading Republican candidate has got first the pool party allegations, but now we're talking about, extramarital affairs. So he's got two things that he's kind of dealing with. Yeah. And then suddenly his old challenger is back in the race as a write-in, and that's where the debate comes in, right? Right.
So they have a debate. It's about 11 days before the election. And in this debate, you have Grunseth, Perpich, and Carlson. Well, how did Carlson get in? Channel 2 had a rule. Yeah. At that time, you had to score at least 5% in a poll to get into a debate. Yeah. Well, Carlson was not scored at 5% because there had been no polls on Carlson's support. Yeah. But Hanley, looked it over and finally made a decision. He agonized over it, but decided he was going to include Carlson.
He's still agonizing over it.
Well, I don't know. I think he may be feeling better after this article that we ran.
But he's still thinking about it.
He is. Yeah.
Well, let's hear a little bit from Bill about his experience behind the scenes.
The thing that always bugged me about this 1990 gubernatorial debate was simply the fact that there were so many coincidences about it that really led me to wonder whether, in fact, it couldn't have been decisive in that Carlson victory. The coincidences were extraordinary. I mean, one of them was the fact that as the campaign went ahead, either the Perpich campaign or the Grunseth campaign canceled all of the other debates. So League of Women Voters, all the normal sort of debates were canceled. KTCA, TPT, Public Television had one scheduled, as we always did, very, very late in the campaign. So they canceled all these debates, but they never canceled ours, and I sort of expected sitting in my office that they would eventually cancel ours, but they didn't. We ended up being so late in the campaign that the extraordinary charges about Grunseth and the pool party and all of that stuff sort of took place in the week or so prior to this debate. And the attention toward that debate became kind of white hot just because everybody was interested. We ended up in a situation where the night before the debate, it was widely anticipated that Grunseth would withdraw from the campaign, leaving the Republican slot to presumably Arne Carlson, who at that point was a write-in candidate. That didn't happen on the evening of the 26th. And so I was left to sit in my office and figure out, well, do we allow Arne Carlson to be in this debate, even though Grunseth is also still in the campaign, even though involving Arne Carlson would be a violation of our longstanding rule that would require 5% performance in a neutral debate, simply because his entry into the campaign was so late. There was no polling. We didn't have any numbers. We didn't know where he was.
And sort of what's the setup? So there's a normal part of the debate, and then they cut to sort of the more, allegations part of the debate, right? Like, I mean, how does it kind of go for these candidates?
Well, they're being interviewed by local reporters. And according to the people who were there at the debate, Perpich and Grunseth seemed very uptight.
Yeah.
Like they didn't want to be there. Perpich kept looking at his watch. Grunseth had his hand in a fist. They were uptight. Carlson seemed very relaxed. The general assessment is that Carlson gained from it because he was able to respond well to the questions and look like a respectable candidate.
Yeah.
There were the denials from Grunseth that the sex scandal had ever occurred.
The pool party specifically, right?
Yeah, the pool party.
Yeah.
And accusations that Perpich might have been involved, which Perpich adamantly denied.
Yeah. And so there's one sort of particular moment that happens in the debate is that Linda McDonnell, who's with the Pioneer Press, is also a neighbor of mine. She asks him specifically about that warm-blooded American male comment, and here is Grunseth's response.
Let me ask you, Mr. Grunseth, there was an article in the paper recently where you acknowledged that there was a period of your life, that the wild years where there was drinking and there were lots of relationships with women. And you said, well, I acted as a red-blooded American male. I'm wondering if that suggests that we should forgive and forget that that's understandable, and particularly as somebody who is running under the banner of family values, I wonder whether those two things are really consistent.
Well, first of all, the legend of Jon Grunseth has been grossly exaggerated, I might add. Secondly, there are things that I've done in my life that I wish I hadn't done, and I think that that's not unlike most of us. But that was some time ago, and that's history in my book.
I have to follow up, though, and I have the article that Linda's referred to before me, and you do say that there was a period in my life through the late 70s and early 80s, which is not quite 10 years ago, when, quote, I was very much a warm-blooded American male. What did you mean by that?
I meant that I dated a lot, Karen, if you will, and I don't think that's out of the ordinary.
Did this include the period when you were still married to your first wife?
No, this is a period, separation and divorce.
So the debate happens, but this isn't the end of the allegations, right? There's more shoes to drop?
There are more shoes to drop, yeah. Seeing these reports, a woman comes forward who claimed that she had had an extramarital affair with Grunseth throughout the 1980s, throughout his first marriage, throughout his second marriage, and only the year before had gone to bed with him in a hotel room in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
And reporter Paul McEnroe had dug up a receipt from the hotel showing that Grunseth had stayed the night, and another woman who was at the dinner beforehand with Grunseth said they had gone off to the hotel room together.
Okay. And so before we say what happens next, you at this point are basically on Grunseth watch, right? Because there's all these people are thinking Grunseth might drop out at any moment. This is a little bit before this story comes out, right? But what are you doing during this period?
Well, during that period, I'm following Grunseth wherever he goes. That was my assignment because, at any point he might quit. At one point, I'm in my car following his car being driven by his driver, and the car goes shooting through an intersection at Snelling Avenue, and I look to the left and right and say, what the heck? And I drive through the red light right after him. And this continues. He eventually pulls up in front of the Griggs building.
In St. Paul.
In St. Paul. The driver lets Grunseth out of the car. I quickly park and run after Grunseth into the Griggs building and chase him. And Grunseth runs out the other side of the building. And the driver is there sitting with his car, and Grunseth jumps into that car and takes off.
So they pulled a fast one on you.
They sure did. I then figured out where he was probably headed, which was another hotel where they had their operations. And I found the room up on an upper-level floor where they were meeting. The door was open. I looked in. Sure enough, they were there.
Yeah.
And it's reported in this book on the history of that election, written by his campaign manager, that Randy Furst stood outside the room lurking.
Lurking?
Yeah.
Well, you have a reputation for being a dogged reporter. So, yeah. So, okay. Then basically this story that we just mentioned about the specific allegation, the hotel in Washington, all that stuff, that comes out. And then what? This is the big finale. But what happens?
Well, 8 hours after the Star Tribune reports the story of the affair in the Sunday paper, Grunseth drops out of the race. The heat is too much.
Yeah, it's 9 days, right, before the election?
Yeah.
Wow.
So there became a whole series of debates. Does Carlson automatically become the Republican candidate? The Republican Party didn't seem to know what to do.
Yeah.
Said it didn't have any rules on how to handle it. There was a Supreme Court decision, and Carlson gets into the race as the Republican candidate, as the runner-up. And the state has to hastily reprint the ballot, which they do. And surprise of surprises, Carlson wins.
Wow. It's by not very much, right?
Well, not by much, by about 60,000 votes, 3%. And Perpich is defeated, and Carlson wins and actually goes on and serves 4 years as governor and actually gets elected for a second term.
Right. And then the coda to this story is that Grunseth leaves Minnesota, leaves the country, and basically has a second life. And you found him in Scotland. But where did he all go? Because that was like the third place he went. So where did he all go after this whole debacle?
I tracked Grunseth down through some emails, and I'm grateful that he actually returned my emails. I was a little surprised that he did, but he did. He went to Australia, worked in a telecommunications operation, and then he bought a cherry orchard in Tasmania.
Okay.
Where he appears to have made a killing on cherries.
Yeah.
And
he becomes a big exporter of cherries.
Yeah, throughout Asia, a portion of Asia, and then sells the orchard, and in his travels meets this woman in Nice in France, and they get married, and now they're settled in a little island off of Scotland.
Where they make excellent scotch, he said, right?
Yeah, right.
Not the couple, but the people in that area.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Grunseth thinks the Star Tribune cost him the election, and the debate had no impact whatsoever.
Oh, no, we did it. It was the newspaper.
Oh, yeah. He thinks it was a very dirty deal, and he thinks we were completely unscrupulous in reporting these false allegations.
And he still maintains that the Hastings event it was not as described. Well, let's just say exactly what he said, since it's important to have his side of the story here. He said that the pool party was BS and the mother of all hit jobs. It took a very innocent 4th of July party and used it to portray me as something evil. As to the affair, I never denied it. What was in contention was when, where, etc. And what he said, what determined the events of the day is what Alan Short and Paul McEnroe wrote with the blessings of their editors. Yeah. So putting the blame on the Star Tribune. But then he sort of adds, now I've had, ironically, thanks to the Strib, an amazing life since 1990. So thanks. So just a nice coda to this whole tale.
Yeah, like he appreciates what we did for him. So.
Yeah. Well, Randy, this is a fascinating story. Thank you for telling it both in the column of Curious Minnesota and here on the podcast, because I think it's, I had never heard this tale. I wasn't here at the time, but I had never heard this tale before. So.
Right. Well, you've met Paul McEnroe, who was, an outstanding investigative reporter.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you ever met Alan Short.
No, I didn't.
But there was some dogged journalism during that thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks so much, Randy. Okay, that's it for today's show. So I realized after we recorded this conversation that we didn't dive much into the question of whether the debate helped Carlson win the election. A number of political experts and people involved, including Carlson himself, said in Randy's story that they did think the debate impacted the outcome of the race. So I invite you to read more details about that in the story, which I will link to in the show notes. Thanks as always for tuning in, and remember that we want to hear from you with questions and feedback at curious@startribune.com. And if you like this show, please tell a friend. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.